Have you ever walked away from a conversation with a sibling and felt like something just didn't sit right? You couldn't quite put your finger on it. Maybe the words were polite, maybe even sweet, but deep down something felt off. It's like you heard them, but you didn't feel them. And as the days go by, that uneasy feeling grows louder, nagging at you like a quiet alarm your heart refuses to ignore. If you're in your 60s or older, you've probably lived through your share of family ups and downs. And you know too, better than anyone, that betrayal doesn't always come screaming through the front door. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it wears a smile. And often it shows up in the words people use when they think you're not listening closely. Let's be honest. When betrayal comes from strangers, it hurts. But when it comes from family, especially a sibling, it cuts differently. This is the person you shared a childhood with. Maybe you defended them from bullies at school, or split your last dollar to help them pay rent, or stood by them through their own heartbreaks. And now something feels off. Maybe they've grown distant. Maybe their words feel a little too polished. Maybe they only call when they need something. Or maybe they've been planting seeds behind your back without saying a word to your face. You're not imagining it. You're not being paranoid. You're picking up on patterns that most people miss. And today, we're going to talk about those patterns. Specifically, how betrayal doesn't always show up in actions. It often shows up in language, hidden in plain sight. Let me tell you a story. A woman named Marie, 67 years old, shared her experience with me. She'd always had a complicated relationship with her younger brother, Tom. For most of their adult lives, he leaned on her, borrowed money, moved into her guest room more than once, and every time he'd promise it was temporary. But over time, Marie began noticing a shift. Not in his actions. That part hadn't changed. But in his words. Instead of saying thank you, he started saying things like, "You've always been the strong one. You'll figure it out." When she brought up financial stress, he'd reply, "Well, you've always made better choices than I have." That might sound like a compliment at first, right? But let's look closer. These are phrases that sound flattering, but they put the weight back on her. They suggest that because she's strong or smart, it's her job to carry the burden. Without ever saying it directly, he was excusing himself from responsibility. And here's the first hidden sign of betrayal. When someone uses kind words to justify unfair behavior. It sounds sweet, but it leaves you feeling heavy. If you've ever had a sibling say something like, "You're just better at handling these things than I am." When they've handed you yet another mess to clean up, you know what I'm talking about. They're not admiring you. They're manipulating you. And that kind of language doesn't build love. It builds resentment, quietly, slowly, until one day you wake up realizing you've been holding a one-sided relationship for years. Now, this isn't about blaming or bitterness. This is about awareness. Because when you know the signs, you take your power back. And speaking of signs, here's another one that's easy to miss. When your sibling starts using vague language when talking about family decisions. Let me ask you, have you ever heard a sibling say something like, "Everyone agrees," or "We think it's best"? But when you press them, you realize they're the only one who thinks that way? That's not just poor communication. That's a subtle form of manipulation. They're hiding behind imaginary consensus to pressure you into compliance. It's the kind of phrase that shows up in conversations about shared inheritance, about caregiving for your aging parents, or about selling the family home. Suddenly you're being told what "we" decided, even though you weren't invited to that discussion. That little word, We is doing a lot of heavy lifting, and it's a red flag. Tom did this to Marie too. When their mother passed away, Tom told Marie, "We've all talked about it, and it just makes sense for you to handle the estate stuff. You're so good with paperwork." But when Marie followed up with their other siblings, none of them had been consulted. Tom had made the decision on his own, and he'd used vague group language to make Marie feel boxed in. Words like that don't just twist the truth. They isolate you. They make you feel like you're the one causing trouble if you speak up. Like the ship has sailed and you're the only one who missed it. But the truth is, that ship was never real to begin with. It was built with words, designed to control without confrontation. And here's the part that stings the most. When you call it out, when you ask for clarity, when you say, "Who exactly is we?" you risk being labeled as difficult, as emotional, as the problem. But I want to tell you something, and I hope you let this sink in. Asking for honesty is not a betrayal. Demanding clarity is not selfish. It's self-respect. So, what do you do when you hear these kinds of phrases? First, pause. Don't react out of anger. Betrayal thrives on chaos. It wants you to explode, to look irrational. But when you stay calm, when you ask quiet, firm questions, when did you all decide this? Who else did you talk to? You expose the gaps. You make the unspoken visible. And often, that alone is enough to shift the dynamic. Let me remind you, words are powerful, but they are also patterns. And once you start recognizing those patterns, you'll see what's real and what's just smoke and mirrors. Now, some of you may be thinking, but my sibling would never do that. We love each other. And I'm not here to convince you otherwise. But love and betrayal are not opposites. Sometimes they live side by side. Not because someone is evil, but because they're wounded, selfish, or too afraid to be honest. That's why these hidden signs and words matter so much. Because by the time the betrayal becomes obvious, by the time property is lost, relationships are damaged, or your role in the family has quietly been erased, the damage is done. But when you catch it early, you have choices. You can protect your peace. You can speak your truth without rage. You can walk away from the manipulation and still keep your dignity intact. You deserve to be treated with honesty and respect. Not just in actions, but in words. Words tell you everything you need to know, if you're listening closely enough. And if you've ever felt that gut instinct, that little pause in your chest when a sibling says something that doesn't feel right, trust it. That's not paranoia. That's wisdom. That's lived experience talking to you. You've carried your family long enough. You've been the peacemaker, the problem solver, the steady one. But it's okay to put the load down. It's okay to say, I need honesty now. Not just niceties. Not just sweet words that hide a hidden agenda, but truth. The kind that respects both your history and your future. You've earned that. And from here on out, we're going to make sure you never ignore those signs again. It's strange how the people closest to us can sometimes feel the farthest away. You know their voice. You know their habits. You know the stories they've told 100 times at family dinners. But one day, you catch a shift. Not in what they say, but in how they say it. Their words feel just a little too careful. Their tone, a little too smooth. And that old sibling closeness you once relied on starts to feel like a memory. That's when you need to listen harder. Not just to their stories, but to the spaces between them. Because the third hidden sign of betrayal often lives in silence. Not the kind of silence that's peaceful. No, this is the silence that sneaks in just before a lie. It's that half-second pause, that deep breath, That sudden distraction right before they answer your question. Let me paint a picture. You ask your brother a simple question. Hey, did you already talk to the lawyer about Mom's will? And before he answers, there's a pause. He scratches his chin, takes a sip of water, glances at his phone. Then he says, Yeah, I've been meaning to call. Things have just been crazy. Sounds harmless, right? But something in your gut clenches. That pause wasn't just him thinking. It was him deciding. See, when people lie, or even just hide something, they often need time to build the story. Their brain needs a second to adjust, to shift into performance mode. And in that tiny delay, you can sense the weight of what's not being said. Maybe they think you won't notice. Maybe they're counting on the fact that you've always given them the benefit of the doubt. But now, you're not so sure. That's how it was for a man I once spoke with. Harold, 72, retired teacher from Ohio. He and his sister had been close their whole lives. Raised each other practically. But after their father passed, something changed. She started making decisions without him. Handling the estate, meeting with financial advisors, all without looping him in. And when Harold would ask her simple questions like, "Did you already sell Dad's truck?" her answers always came with that telltale pause, that inhale, that slight look away. Eventually, Harold learned the truth. His sister had sold several items and deposited the money into an account with only her name on it. She didn't want a fight, so she tried to avoid one by telling half-truths, carefully timed, carefully worded. Now, I want to be very clear here. Not every pause means someone is lying. Some people naturally take a moment before they speak. But when those pauses are paired with shifting eyes, sudden tension, or stories that seem too vague or too detailed, you have to ask yourself, what are they trying to protect? And why is it so hard for them to be direct with me? You've got every right to ask for clarity. You're not being dramatic. You're being present. And when someone responds with discomfort to your calm, reasonable questions, that's often because they know they've crossed a line, or they're planning to. The fourth sign you need to watch for is even trickier, because it sounds like love on the surface. It's when a sibling says something like, "You're overthinking it," or "You always make things bigger than they are." These phrases are called dismissals, and they're designed to make you feel like the problem. Not them, not the situation, but you. This tactic is subtle. It's not yelling. It's not name-calling. It's gaslighting in a soft voice, wrapped in a blanket of familiarity. And it's incredibly common in families where one sibling wants to avoid responsibility or hide something they've done. Think back. Have you ever brought up a real concern, only to be told you're being too emotional? Or tried to clarify a money matter, only to be brushed off with, "Why do you always assume the worst?" If so, I want you to hear this loud and clear. Your need for clarity is not a flaw. It's a strength. And when someone tries to make you feel guilty for simply asking questions, you're not dealing with a misunderstanding. You're dealing with someone who doesn't want you to see the full picture. This happened to a woman named Denise, 68, who shared her story with me during a support group meeting. Denise and her older sister had grown up close, but when their aunt passed away and left behind a sizable inheritance, things started getting murky. Denise would ask gentle questions like, "Have you spoken to the estate attorney yet?" And her sister would say, "You worry too much. It's all being taken care of." Weeks passed, then months, and eventually, Denise discovered that her sister had already claimed her portion, and more. all while insisting Denise was just paranoid for asking about it. Do you see how that works? The moment you raise a flag, they reach for the extinguisher. You're imagining things. Don't be so sensitive. These aren't real answers. They're verbal sedatives, meant to make you second-guess your instincts. But let me tell you something. After 60, your instincts are sharper than ever. Because you've lived. You've seen people lie. You've watched people change. And deep down, you can feel when something isn't right. So what do you do when a sibling tries to dismiss your concerns with kind-sounding phrases? Stay grounded. Don't argue. Don't try to prove how reasonable you are. That's a trap. Instead, go back to the facts. Quietly, calmly. Restate your question. I understand if you think I'm overthinking it, but I'd still like to know when you signed the paperwork. Stay in your lane. Stay in your truth. You're not responsible for their discomfort. You're responsible for protecting your peace. And speaking of peace, let me share the fifth sign. It's when a sibling's language slowly shifts from inclusion to distance. Where they once said we, they now say I. Where they once asked for your opinion, they now inform you of what's already been decided. It's not loud. It's not cruel. It's subtle, like water pulling away from the shore. And you don't notice the tide's gone until you're standing alone. Maybe they stop asking you to help with family decisions. Maybe they start calling less. Maybe they tell mutual relative stories that leave your part out entirely. This isn't just a shift in behavior. It's a shift in ownership, of the narrative, of the power dynamic. And often, it's a sign that they're carving out a version of the family story that no longer includes you the way it used to. And the language always gives it away. I've decided Mom should move in with me. I already talked to the bank about the house. These aren't statements of collaboration. They're declarations of control. And when that starts to happen, you've got two choices. You can stay silent and let the distance grow, or you can step forward and ask, when did we stop being a team? That one question, asked calmly and clearly, can shake a person awake, or it can show you exactly where you stand. No matter which response you get, you deserve to know the truth. And the truth doesn't always scream. Sometimes it's tucked inside soft sentences. Sometimes it's buried in the pauses. And sometimes it comes in the form of a smile that no longer reaches their eyes. But you've earned the right to see it all clearly. Somewhere along the way, maybe you've told yourself, it's just how they are. Or, that's just family. You try to brush it off. You try to be the bigger person. Because after all these years, who wants to start a battle over words? Over tones? Over pauses and glances? But here's the truth. No one really says out loud. Sometimes the betrayal isn't in what they do. It's in what they no longer say to you. What they no longer include you in. The conversations that happen without you, the plans they form while pretending it's all still a group decision. And that brings us to one of the most painful, but most revealing, hidden signs of betrayal. When your siblings' words begin to rewrite reality. You'll hear phrases like, "That's not what happened," or "You're remembering it wrong." And not just once. It becomes a pattern. You share a memory or express how something made you feel, and they immediately jump in to correct, redirect, or completely dismiss your version of the past. It's not just frustrating. It's destabilizing. Because when someone you've known your whole life starts telling you that your truth isn't real, it makes you question your own footing. You might wonder, am I being too sensitive? Or maybe I did misunderstand? But let me tell you something. No one, not even a sibling, has the right to rewrite your lived experience. This kind of language isn't always aggressive. In fact, it's often delivered with a soft voice and a smile. I think you're just remembering it differently. That's not how Mom meant it. We all agreed, you just forgot. These words chip away at your confidence, one sentence at a time. And over time, you might start silencing yourself just to avoid the emotional gymnastics. It's emotional manipulation disguised as family bonding. And if it's happening to you, it's not your fault. It's a tactic, whether conscious or not, to maintain control. Because when someone can make you doubt your memory, your emotions, and your right to speak up, they win. They rewrite the past to justify the present. And the most heartbreaking part, many of us take years, decades, to finally see it for what it is. But once you do, there's no going back. Because when someone constantly reshapes the story to make you the problem, it's not a conversation anymore. It's a performance. So what can you do when you notice this happening? First, stop explaining yourself. You don't owe anyone a defense of your memory. Your feelings are valid. You lived through it. Second, respond with gentle but firm language. Say, "That's how I experienced it." Or, "We may remember it differently, but that doesn't make my version less real." You're not trying to win an argument. You're reclaiming your space in the story. And if they can't handle that, if they keep insisting their version is the only truth, then that's a bigger red flag than any single disagreement. And now we come to the final sign, the one that never lies. It's not in their tone. It's not in their pauses. It's in the slow, steady mismatch between their words and their actions. Because a sibling who's betraying you won't always say the wrong thing. Sometimes they say all the right things. Of course, I've got your back. We're in this together. I'd never do anything to hurt you. But then they do. And it's not a dramatic moment. It's not always loud or obvious. It's in the small things, the missed calls, the decisions made without you, the family conversations you weren't invited to, the responsibilities dumped on you with no discussion. And when you ask about it, they say something like, "I didn't think it was a big deal," or "I figured you'd understand." Let me tell you something powerful. When someone's actions and words don't match, believe the actions every time. Words are easy. They cost nothing. But actions, that's where the truth lives. And you've lived long enough to know that promises don't mean much if they're never followed through. I want to share the story of Ray, 70, a widower from Minnesota. After his wife passed, his two sisters promised they'd help him handle the house, check in regularly, and support him emotionally. They meant well, he thought. But weeks passed, then months. The phone calls slowed. The offers of help disappeared. When Ray reached out, they'd say, "We're just so busy." Or, "You're doing great. We didn't want to intrude." It wasn't that they said anything hurtful, but what hurt was the silence, the absence, the promises made, then forgotten. Ray said to me once, "It wasn't what they said. It's what they stopped doing." And that's the key, isn't it? You can't measure love in words alone. You have to measure it in consistency, in effort, in the way someone shows up even when it's inconvenient, especially when it's inconvenient. So if you've noticed a sibling whose words sound loving, but their actions leave you feeling alone, unimportant, or used, don't ignore that. Don't write it off. Don't cover it up with the old excuse of, "That's just how they are." You have every right to expect alignment between words and behavior, between promises and participation, between what they say in front of others and how they treat you when no one's watching. And if you're sitting there right now thinking, "This sounds like my family," please know you're not alone. More people experience betrayal from siblings than they're willing to admit, because it's embarrassing, because it feels like failure, because we're taught that family means forever, even when it hurts. But I want you to hear this clearly. You don't have to accept mistreatment just because it comes with shared DNA. You're allowed to set boundaries. You're allowed to walk away from dysfunction. You're allowed to protect your heart, even from family. And most of all, you're allowed to trust yourself, your instincts, your voice, your need for peace. So the next time your siblings' words leave you feeling confused, dismissed, or quietly hurt, pause. Look deeper. Ask yourself, do their words match their actions? Do their compliments come with expectations? Do their pauses feel like avoidance? Is their concern just another way to shift guilt? Because once you learn to read the signs, not with anger but with wisdom, you become the one who holds the power. You don't have to yell. You don't have to fight. You just have to see clearly. Because truth doesn't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it comes as a whisper, a feeling, a pause in the conversation. And once you hear it, you can never unhear it. If this video resonated with you, I invite you to share your experience in the comments. You never know who might feel less alone after reading your story. And if you found this helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel Strong Elderly Life, where we speak truth, find strength, and build peace in every chapter of life. You've lived through enough. Now it's time to live with clarity, courage, and the calm confidence of someone who finally sees things as they really are. Here's to your peace, your power, and your beautiful, untouchable wisdom.